Welcome to the Provoke Media Podcast. I'm Megan Keogan, host of today's episode and head of content partnerships here at Provoke. As venture capital and fintech slows, could this be the moment Greentech rises to the occasion? In today's episode, we'll discuss how the rise of ESG communications is shining a light on the opportunity ahead for Greentech. As so many climate and sustainability and/or renewable energy-focused technology startups attract investor and public funding attention, this wealth of new market entrants makes this space increasingly enticing. It also presents an interesting communications opportunity. For communications and PR professionals, there's so much to learn about what happened with fintech and the challenges that any nascent sector faces with driving brand awareness. How can we take these learnings and apply them to the green tech firms working to tackle the challenges created by climate change and environmental disruption? And what role do the big tech companies play in elevating these new innovations? With us today is Ben Romberg, Client Strategy Director at Hotwire Global, to help us answer these questions and many more. Ben, thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be here. Thank you very much, Megan, and appreciate that introduction.
Absolutely.
Just to give a little bit of background, I think you touched on some very interesting areas that we've been discussing in great detail at Hotwire. And I think probably the most prominent is just about the rise of green tech and the rise of climate and renewable tech, which we see as a really burgeoning area. My responsibility at Hotwire is really focused around the development of our ESG capabilities and strategy, but also how specifically we work to develop our clients' approach towards environmental, social, and governance structures that they can then take to market, they can communicate, and they can start to build and set their brands around. And in that area, we see increasingly clean tech, renewable tech, and climate tech as being, core components of this sort of burgeoning space, and really an interesting opportunity area. So great to talk to you about it today.
Thank you. We are excited to sort of lay some groundwork. It's certainly a topic many folks are speaking about today, or it's becoming very much more on people's radar, especially as we look at, investing into new technology and the opportunities that presents this year and next year as the economy is shifting and ESG priorities are shifting. It's very much like we kind of mentioned before, such an opportunity for PR and comms folks to really capitalize. Just as we sort of start out this conversation, can you provide us with the definition of green tech, kind of lay some groundwork for us so that we're all working off the same understanding, and then we'll dive in?
Yeah, absolutely. So green tech is an umbrella term. It really sort of captures companies that work with technologies that ultimately are helping to improve the planet and address many of the challenges that come about as a consequence of climate change. They tend to be very environmentally focused. They tend to be sort of focused predominantly in the energy sector, but they also work with cutting edge technology that's also looking to address some of the key challenges around renewable technology, around solar tech, around also biology and plant tech, green tech being, a focus on, for example, tree scanning devices, using drones to sort of look at, the outputs and CO2 emissions that are connected with forestry. And it's also an umbrella term that has a number of different categorizations that sit underneath it. Those would include climate tech, clean tech. These are all sort of component parts that sit underneath green tech as a term as well. But it's becoming this catch-all term, and I think increasingly there's lots of different types of technology that sit underneath this catch-all phrase. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done to understand what those categories are, and also what they mean to communications professionals, what they also mean to target audiences and to investors, as well as journalists.
Certainly, and that really actually segues into one of the first spaces that that PR and comms and consultancy can really capitalize, which is these burgeoning tech companies that may have some incredible scientific or technology offering that falls into the category of what bigger companies don't know that they don't know exists out there. And as you're speaking about kind of the categories of the umbrella terms of green tech and then the smaller spaces within that, it's just such an interesting place when we talk about where you can play a role as somebody at Hotwire or the next Greentech consulting firm to help a company identify how they get found?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and it's something we talk about a lot at Hotwire, which is trying to understand how to create a story that's compelling, that's engaging, and that expresses and extrapolates the value that an organization is looking to bring to its investors, to its customers, to the most important people it's trying to speak to. We work with a lot of different brands in helping to understand how best to do this. Specifically working with clients like Dell Technologies, IBM, and Honeywell, all of whom are also developing their ESG approach, their ESG strategy. They've created teams, they've created sort of subcompartments within the organization that help to sort of, invite more discussion and also invite more innovation around how they then bring their climate tech or then green tech solutions to the fore. And so in doing that, a lot of the sort of recipe for how we can help smaller organizations do that sort of exists. So I think a big component to that is the storytelling aspect. How do you get the narrative right? How do you tell a story that's compelling enough that it's going to be picked up by the press? It's going to be picked up by people who, for example, are specifically looking to understand what's the opportunity, what does the investment opportunity look like with this organization, as well as understanding how it helps the planet and how it helps to underpin the specific challenge that's being addressed. And I think where we see the opportunity is that some green tech organizations have got this right, but others are still trying to get there. And I think there's lots of learnings in the fintech sector that can be brought to the fore. We've seen some immensely successful fintech companies over the last 10, 15 years that have become household names. And I think there's a real opportunity for green tech firms to sort of emulate some of that success.
Yeah, that it kind of segued right into my next question, which was, it sounds so familiar from the fintech story that we are all kind of familiar with when we think of like, what have we learned from the past? What do we apply to this next era or this next chapter? And what are some of those technologies? And so when we, if you're open to it, I'd love to go dive a little deeper into what we learned from fintech. Some of those takeaways, you spoke about the storytelling and sort of the building a brand around a personality or a persona, how that translated for fintech, and what does that actually look like when we apply it to green tech? How do those lessons and learnings shift when we're talking about a different industry space?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what fintech got right. I think some of the more compelling fintech brands and some of the more successful stories were based around an inspirational technology or an inspirational team that was able to create that technology. And they got very good at creating a very recognizable brand. Both in terms of the name, quite catchy names that have become, for example, like Monzo and Revolut, that have also got very catchy logos associated with them. Stripe, they've then been able to take that brand and take that name and that story and very successfully present it to the media, to journalists, but also to investors, and do so in a way that it creates this very cohesive success story that builds on itself. I think it's also interesting how fintech positioned itself as disruptive, and how they saw the sort of the antithesis of what they were, the big banks, the big mainstream sort of financial enterprises of the day, and said, we are not like that. We're different. We're gonna change the game. We're going to bring in new technology that's going to completely, revolutionize this field. And we're going to try and steal their lunch as well. And I think that's a very important story for green tech, because a lot of the green tech companies are looking to do the same. They are focused on the fossil fuel industry and understanding what some of the big challenges that have come out of that industry, some of the damage that's been done, and what's the inverse. How can we be disruptive? How can we change the way that industry has operated? How can we learn from it, but also how can we introduce technology that's going to solve the challenges that have originated from there? So being disruptive in the sense that they can disrupt what's happened from a fossil fuel perspective is very interesting, and also a learning, I think, from fintech. But at its heart, I think it's about telling a really good story and making sure that that's compelling enough to be picked up, by the media,
Mm-hmm.
by mainstream press, as well as specific or niche publications, and also doing so from a team or from a persona perspective. There
Right.
might be a charismatic founder or someone who previously worked in a large enterprise or large fossil fuel industry firm and decided to then switch and change the story and change the approach. I think all of those kind of compelling human stories are also a key part of what I think some of the more successful green techs are getting right and what they can learn from the fintechs.
Yeah. And you kind of brought up the point of, we've spoken a lot already about the smaller companies or these disruptor companies, which often we think of as young startups or small no name brands that none of us have heard of. But of course, there are large companies also working in the green tech space. And I'm interested in hearing your perspective on the role that the large companies also play
Mm-hmm.
in green tech and where they contribute or create opportunity also.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a big shift in the way that a lot of large technology companies are operating to now consider their carbon footprints, to consider how impactful their technology is, but also to start initiatives and to start innovation or sort of skunk work type projects where they're actually able to sort of come up with solutions that help to rectify some of the damage or some of the problems that are being caused. I mean, we've caught sight of a really interesting climate tech initiative called Frontier, which was announced earlier this year. It's a collaboration between Stripe, Alphabet, Meta, Shopify, and McKinsey, and it plans to purchase $925 million worth of permanent carbon removal from companies that are developing technology that can help to sort of spur this market for carbon capture.
Mm-hmm.
We've also been looking at organizations and working with organizations like Autodesk and Autodesk Foundation, who are invested in climate change innovation, and large technology firms like IBM that have the IBM.org initiatives
Yeah.
and are focused on how they can impact or move the dial against the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a lot of sort of impact happening through industry partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a lot of focus for these firms to try and change or come up with innovative ways where they can actually build sort of startups within
Yeah.
that can help to address these challenges. So it's happening on sort of both
Yeah.
sides. And it's interesting because there are lots of great stories in there that aren't necessarily being told or getting the levels of press attention that you'd kind of
Yeah.
hope at this stage. And it's looking at that I think is really interesting.
Yeah. I'm thinking of, and obviously not the intended story, but I'm thinking the story of that many large organizations sitting around a table. I think the first example you had mentioned, Alphabet, and I'm gonna blank on their names, but I was, as you were telling that story, I'm picturing,
Frontier, yeah,
yeah, Frontier. I'm picturing six different boardrooms basically convening to
yeah.
all agree on an initiative right there, which in and of itself feels worthy of a story of however that came to be and came to fruition. But they all agreed.
Hugely, yeah. I think that there is a story in that. I think
Yeah.
it's a lot of it's about finding where those areas of overlap are. I think
Mm-hmm.
what a lot of these big organizations have found is that they are focused on similar types of initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they look at it on paper, they see that there's a common overlap with many of their partners, with many of
Mm-hmm.
their customers, and many of the organizations they already work with. And if they're to pool resources, if they're to sort of collectively work together
Yeah.
in partnership, they can see a lot more opportunity and a lot more effectiveness and a lot
Right.
more impact than trying to go it alone. And I think the same is true with smaller green tech companies that are
Mm-hmm.
often have created a technology solution or created an approach that's really effective and actually does something very capable and very smart. But their scale and their reach is going to be limited because they're working out of a warehouse or a small
Yeah.
or a university funded program, and that's not big enough in order to be able to make an impact. So how do they connect
Mm-hmm.
with and how do they get investment or how do they connect with a firm that gives them that scale and that
Yeah.
reach, make a broader
Yeah.
impact? and how do we help them to tell that story to get them there?
Yeah. Which in no way was really it's such a natural segue, but in no way was our planned course of conversation to go, but it does lend itself to exactly like the role a company like Hotwire can play, which is helping craft that story, consulting on the messaging opportunities and the persona opportunities or the partnership types of collaborations and how to message those larger scale things. One, to be found by a bigger company, or two, to also rally the sources of other companies. And I know that that's one piece of the puzzle that you are working on at Hotwire, but I'll let you speak. Sorry.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely something we focus on, which is thinking about the types of personas, the audiences, thinking about specifically how do we reach the most important people that this organization needs to connect with. How do we seed the story in a way that it will get noticed, but also how does it resonate and connect and spur on the right types of conversations with those right audience types. And I think understanding that is part of the equation. But also, I think it's understanding what those audience challenges are, and specifically how do their products, how do their services, how do their approaches specifically meet those challenges and help them to overcome. And I think that equation's got to be understood first in order to be able to make sure that the message resonates. And I think increasingly, and you hear this from the likes of Gartner and Forrester, but increasingly the importance of getting that value proposition to be understood and for that to resonate with the target audience. I think that's first and foremost for a lot of green tech firms. So if you've got if you can articulate your value, you can articulate that in a way that is correctly understood by the people that you're trying to reach, then that's half the puzzle. The next question is how to get it out there and how to make sure it resonates. And I think the branding component for a lot of green tech firms is very important. Making sure it's a brand, it's a identity that will resonate, and that is a big component of the work that we do at Hotwire. But also understanding, what underpins that, what gives you the right to be able to talk about, your solution, your products in this arena, and how do you separate from perhaps other organizations that are looking to do the same thing. So understanding where your positioning is and understanding how it competes with other organizations that are perhaps trying to do the same thing, I think is a part of it. And we spoke earlier about how climate tech and how there's all these different sort of verticals underneath the green tech umbrella. And that adds a layer of complexity as well. I think there are going to be investors, there are going to be firms that are looking at all of those different subcompartments, if you like, and thinking, this is the area that I need to focus on, or I'm just looking for a renewable tech solution within the energy field. And it might be that you don't get discovered unless you've got that categorization, you've got that branding right, and you're playing in the right space. So helping to identify that position and helping to place these organizations in the right area, I think that's crucial here.
It's such a key place that a firm like Hotwire or PR professionals and comms professionals in general can play right now, which is thinking like a journalist, which is telling the same story from so many different angles or through so many different lenses, because the audiences are vast, whether it's the different types of companies that could utilize the services of one of these smaller green tech companies, or whether it's messaging to the media and then identifying what audience within the media that you're speaking to investor groups, that it's finding the core story and being able to use so many different perspectives to convey that story and create some consistency or the red thread across all of them, which is really so critical in the growth of a company like a green tech company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to work as a journalist. I was at the BBC for some years, and before that, I was also working as a financial journalist. And I know that some stories are absolutely more compelling than others, particularly when they come in the form of a press release or a press pack, where you're trying to understand what an organization is trying to say, either to its investors or to a wider sort of audience, or whether it's specifically to a journalist that's very specialized in this field. And I think this is an increasingly specialized field. And I think there are some phenomenal environmental journalists out there. There are phenomenal journalists that are focused on this sector in particular. And they're able to understand when there's an organization that's trying to greenwash, when there's an organization that's trying to get its name out there just for the sake of it, as much as trying to understand the substance of a story and what's really valuable. And I think that sharing that value and being able to be clear about the real impact that an organization is making is really crucial. So telling that story in the right way, and making sure that impact is conveyed is key. And as you say, making sure that red thread runs through from the experience that an investor might have by exploring an organization's credentials or looking at a website, all the way through to picking up an article in the press, or even being exposed to some marketing collateral or the brand. That all has to have a very consistent line, and making sure that it tells one consistent story as well. Again, that consistency element, making sure that one message resonates is part of what we focus on at Hotwire. But I think it's also, a really important learning that, a lot of PR professionals can take from the fintech sector. They have been great at telling that one cohesive story. They have been really good at selling that one, brand identifier that sort of resonates and makes such a clear impact across a very broad industry.
I love that kind of sentiment to summarize where we've been here a bit, and thoughts on anything that we haven't touched on. I know this was very much sort of like this 101 overview crash course in Greentech and the opportunity that therein lies for comms professionals, but got me kind of converted. Like I'll be signing up to work at Hotwire next. what have we overlooked here in the kind of this primer conversation from your perspective?
I think it does go further into that sort of measuring impact piece. So being able to clearly articulate what the real world impact of an organization or of a specific green tech firm is, and how that can sit very, very carefully alongside a growth story. I think all the, or at least most, I'd say, green tech organizations are looking to try and scale and implement their solutions on a much wider basis. And so in that there is value creation, in that there is revenue growth, but it's also tying it back to what's the real world impact. How is it helping to solve and mitigate a lot of the challenges being brought about by climate change? How is it helping to reduce the carbon emissions of a particular sector, or a particular entity? Or what is being done that can sort of really be talked about firsthand by environmental journalists who are going to be looking and scrutinizing this these organizations very closely. And I think if you can articulate that impact, if you can show that impact story in a way that resonates, in a way that is not trying to not using smoke and mirrors, but actually is very carefully crafted and has data to back it up, I think that's that's a cool part of this as well.
Yeah.
So just, I mean, in terms of advice more than anything, I think what we've found is that just being very wary that you have to have that data, you have to have that real world impact first in front of the story before you can then get into talking about what the revenue growth or what the goals or the value creation looks like, because that's really secondary here. What's most important is how we can help to move the dial.
Absolutely. At the risk of opening a new conversation right when we were wrapping up, you kind of brought up the metrics conversation, which has been a part of nearly every podcast that we've done here, every article we've done at Provoke. It's just really the common piece or question that we're all talking about. In terms of how these metrics look when you measure your own impact at a place like Hotwire, do those metrics shift when you're working with a green tech company? Are there different things that you're looking at specifically through the lens of a green tech company versus other tech companies when you're looking at your impact in that measurement story, from
Absolutely.
the agency perspective? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it goes back to that real world impact. I think that when you're measuring, for example, we have a framework which we refer to as the three R's of reputation, relationship, and revenue goals that a lot of firms focus on. These tend to make up the broad sort of communications and marketing objectives of most major technology companies. They're either looking to improve or shift their reputation positively, build or strengthen relationships that they want to have with their most important people or customers, and then ultimately grow their revenue. And I think across those three R's, I think you've got to think very carefully in the green tech sector that the reputational piece will be directly linked to the impact that this organization is having in the real world, what it's doing to move the dial vis-a-vis climate change, and what it's doing to make a positive, net positive impact. The same will be true with relationships. It might not just be the media or the investor component. It might also be the relationships they have with the scientific community, or with educational organizations, or with government and policymakers. And so there's a different component there. And the revenue piece is again different when it comes to nonprofit. When it's an organization that's looking to secure a funding round, but do so in a way to scale up or sustainably grow the organization so it can have a bigger real world impact, not just to generate profits for shareholders or investors. And I think that's another component to it that changes the way we would measure in this space. It goes more closely aligned to the types of ESG initiatives you see in large organizations. There isn't necessarily always a big revenue or profit driven goal aligned to what ESG is trying to do. It's actually more around how can we improve, or how can we have a real world impact on what we're doing vis-a-vis climate change, or how can we introduce goals or benchmarks that are going to help to improve the working conditions for an organization around its circular economy or its plastic reduction drive. There's lots of different elements that can sort of scale out from there. All of those can be measured. Those are all data points as well. And I think it's very interesting to see that also form part of a campaign dynamic, or form part of what a communications or marketing approach can deliver on to.
I see many additional podcast conversations here that we can grow off of this original one, and could keep going for a long time. But I will also spare you and let you get back to your day as well, Ben. But this has been a fantastic conversation, and really enjoy your expertise, sharing, educating all of us on the green tech opportunities out there for comms professionals. This has been the Provoke Media Podcast. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Megan. Appreciate it.
And this has been the Provoke Media Podcast with Hotwire Global, and we thank you for listening today.